I'd like to welcome you to our first lesson in our spring quarterly of 2021, entitled Paul's Desire to Visit Rome. Our lesson will primarily, and our quarterly will primarily be in Paul's epistle to the church in Rome. And our lesson will focus in on Romans chapter 1, verses 8 through 17. But nevertheless, our first verse, number 8, says, "First I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world." We see that Paul does a general and a basic method of thanksgiving that is common in all of his letters. He thanks God and thanks God for the growth, the potential, and the faithfulness of the members of Rome, as well as it's a common pattern he does in all of the letters he writes to all of the churches that he establishes, except that the church in Galatia. And for a little historical background, Paul did not formally plant this church or establish this church personally. This church was probably established from Jews who had accepted Jesus Christ after Pentecost, who had accepted Jesus on the day of Pentecost and had migrated back to Rome and had established a church that way, or churches in Rome that way. Paul continues in verse number 9, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you." Right? And that's important to understand, because Paul was an apostle of prayer. And Paul lets us know that he serves God with his spirit, as opposed to the vain, empty worship that he served God in his hypocritical religious way that he served as a Pharisee, right? So, we move along to verse number 10. "Also, in my prayers, asking that somehow, by God's will, I may now at last succeed in coming to you." Now, this is a beautiful example of biblical-based prayer. Notice that we ask for what we want and leave the results to God's will. God is the one that answers prayer, right? Now, this is far different than what we see today with the whole format of declare and decree that has been espoused by those who teach that of positive confession theology, that ignores the sovereignty of God, that focuses on the individual's faith being the final, or the amount of the individual's faith as being the final determining factor on whether God answers prayer, not recognizing that of the will of God. But nevertheless, we see a common thing that all prayer should be centered around one particular verse, and that is 1 John chapter 5, verse 14. And let me turn to that right quick, right? All prayer should be centered around the will of God, right? Listen to this. "Now this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us," right? Real biblical faith is entrenched in the recognition that not everything that we ask for is within the will of God, right? So Paul recognizes that if it is in God's will, God would make a way that he would visit, or make an opportunity for him to visit Rome, a church that he had not established. "For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. Now we know that the Greek word translated gift comes from the term charisma. Now the book of Romans uses this term to describe gift or spiritual gift in three different possible ways, right? One, it could be Christ himself, Jesus himself being the gift. Number two, a general blessing from God. It could be spiritual gifts itself that we find in chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. But it's quite possible and quite probable that it could be all three, because all three are mentioned in the book of Romans, verse 12. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. Now this verse just basically gives us a glimpse of Paul's genuine humility. Now verse number 13, it says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often attended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some fruit or harvest among you, as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. Now, the harvest of fruit can mean one of two things, or one of three things. It could mean spiritual attitudes that we find in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 23. It could mean righteous acts, which we find in Philippians chapter 4, verses 16 through 17. Or Hebrews chapter 13, verse 15, or new converts. But I think possibly Paul is probably referring to all three. Or should I say, referring to the third, new converts. I am under obligation. Now the New King James and the King James uses the term debtor, but the English Standard Version uses I am under obligation. And says, I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to the foolish. And verse number 15, I'll read it together with it. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. Now, we know that Paul had an obligation to God to preach the gospel. Now, we know that Paul's obligation to fulfill this mandate from God stems back to Acts chapter 9, verse 15. And we also see that the text lets us know that to both to Greek and to barbarian. So Paul uses two different terms to describe the Gentiles, and two more terms that parallel Greeks and barbarians. Greeks and wise parallel each other, and barbarians and foolish parallel each other. And I think the parallel has to do with the Greeks and wise, which are those two words are synonymous with each other, meaning that sophistication of language and education and status, where barbarian has to do with uneducated and unsophisticated, as well as barbarians and foolish, unsophisticated, and culture as well. But what we know that when it comes to the gospel that Paul preached of Jesus Christ, he lets the reader or the recipient of his message know that God is not a respecter of persons. The gospel is free to all who believe. Now this moves us to our last two verses. And our last two verses, I like to say, are the linchpin that summarize the totality of Paul's epistle to Rome. And I'll go ahead and read them together, and then I will give exposition independently of these two verses. And the first verse is, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." The next verse, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous or the just shall live by faith." Now, verse 16 is probably a verse that is often quoted. One, because it's a beautiful verse, but two, it is a verse that pretty much sums up the book in itself. The first verse lets us know, the first part of the verse, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel," or "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ," lets us know that Paul was not ashamed, and he had no trepidations, and he was not disappointed or had no regrets of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. So much so that Paul had been imprisoned in Philippi, according to Acts chapter 16, verses 23 through 14. He was chased out of Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17, verse 10. He was smuggled out of Berea in Acts chapter 17, verse 14. He was laughed at in Athens in Acts chapter 17, verse 32. He was regarded as foolish. He was regarded as a fool, should I say, in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 and verse 23. And he was stoned in Galatia in Acts chapter 14, verse 19. So we see that Paul went through all different kinds of persecution and ridicule, and this was all for the sake of God's glory in Christ Jesus. And he is letting us know that although it was foolish to some people, it was the power of God for salvation. Now we know that the term power in English is the English word, we get the English word for dynamite, right? And then we have the term salvation, which is used 5 times in Romans. And it simply means deliverance or rescue. Now, it is deliverance from being lost. It is deliverance from God's wrath, deliverance from willful spiritual ignorance, from evil self-indulgence, from the darkness of false religion, and it is a rescue from the ultimate penalty of sin, which is eternal separation from God. And this is offered to what? All that believe. And belief means, or to believe means to trust, rely on, or to have faith, right? Now, what is faith? Saving faith consists of 3 elements. And these elements are, it is mental. The mind understands the gospel and the truth of Christ, right? Number 2, it is emotional. One embraces the truthfulness of those facts with sorrow over sin and joy over God's mercy and grace. And also volition. The sinner submits his will to Christ and trusts in him alone as the only hope of salvation. That is true, genuine, authentic faith that produces obedience. And the last part of verse number 16 talks about to the Jew first and also Greek. And this brings about the order of operation in God's plan of salvation. And we find this first and foremost in the Gospels, where we find in Matthew chapter 10, verse 6, where Jesus says, I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then after his death and resurrection, he commissions his apostles to go first and foremost to Jerusalem, to Judea, to the Samaritans, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. Meaning that after the offer of salvation has been first and foremost been offered to Israel, then the gospel is supposed to go outside of Israel and outside of that first outcast of Israel, meaning the Samaritans. And then it's supposed to go to the God-fearers, who we know as the Gentiles, who had a first interest in Judaism. That leads us into verse 17. For in it, the righteousness of God or from God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous or just shall live by faith. Right? Now, the righteousness of God, or better translated, the righteousness from God, has to do with being justified, declared right with God. And the way this happens is by faith and faith in love alone, by what God has offered in Jesus Christ. And then it talks about, and those who have placed their trust in Jesus Christ, and those who have received the righteousness through that faith in Jesus Christ that God has offered, they are to live by that faith in the operation of faith and obedience in that. And it says, the just shall live by faith. Now, it's a quote that I got that talks about a person living by their faith. It's a quote that I got from a Bible scholar. And the Bible scholar primarily deals with biblical counseling. His name is J. Adams. And he says this about genuine faith. He says, what we truly believe determines what we do.